The Houston Asian American Archive collects individual oral histories, making these stories accessible in the forms of recordings and transcripts. Our heritage speaking for itself. Discover how your heritage fits into the story of Houston at HAAA.rice.edu.
Dear Houston, happy Valentine's Day and welcome to this very special love-themed podcast, When Haru Meets Saavi, Love Stories from the Houston Asian American Archive. I'm your host for today, Ann Shi, and we're going to hear stories from members of the Asian American community about their experiences with and feelings about love. Love is, of course, a broad subject and one opens to all kinds of interpretations. That's why we've tried to incorporate stories old and new that resonate across time, space, and culture to explore the quantum entanglements, or are they just hormones, that can sometimes conjure up butterflies in our stomachs through a mere glance from across a crowded room. We'll hear stories that speak to both unorthodox and traditional notions of love, stories of forbidden love, love at first sight, and love preordained. We'll ask the question, can we, as Asian Americans, be in love as who we are? And more broadly, can any of us be in love as who we are? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's sit back and listen to love tell its own story.
关关雎鸠，在河之洲。窈窕淑女，君子好逑。
Love at first sight. It's our most romantic notion, and one that transcends geography, culture, and for the most part, common sense. Who hasn't been instantly enamored by a total stranger, only to discover we've fallen in love with an ideal, or even a mannequin, at Neiman Marcus? I have to confess that is only partially a joke. But in some cases, love at first sight lives up to its lofty name, and even sustains itself, sometimes against incredible odds. Our first love story features back home Ji, who was born in a small village in China in 1922.
Okay, let's see now. I arrived in San Francisco after about 23 days on the ship coming from Hong Kong to San Francisco. I spent about 30 days on Angel Island alone at the age of 9 until I had passed all the questioning and been allowed to come on to the mainland. And I stayed in San Francisco for a few weeks. And I ended up joining my grandparents in Algiers, Louisiana, which is across this river from New Orleans. And I started school there. And a couple of years later, in 1934, I moved to Mississippi, where my schooling stopped because Mississippi had a law that prohibited Chinese children from going to school, to a white public school. And I worked from the age of 13 until I was 20 years old when I got drafted into World War II.
Mr. Ji was drafted into the U.S. Army as a photographer. He trained for a year in the States before arriving in England in 1943, where he was stationed for 10 months. This was followed by a year stationed in France, and finally, 4 months in Germany. Despite bearing witness to and documenting the horror of war, Baek Ji, who sadly passed away in June of 2020, always maintained that one scene stood out among them all.
I arrived in England in November of 1943, and on New Year's Day, I was stationed in Manchester, England. Another Chinese soldier and I decided that New Year's Day would be a good time to go and find a good Chinese restaurant and have a good meal. So Liverpool was 1 hour's bus ride away. So he and I got on a bus and went to Liverpool, and we asked the bus driver to drop us off as close to Chinatown as possible, and he dropped us right in Chinatown. We went to the first restaurant. It was crowded, didn't have room for us. We went to another restaurant, same thing. We went to the third restaurant, packed. We start walking out, and the waiter came running after us. Said, "We got 2 people leaving." So we went back and sat at a little table for 2. And it so happens that I sat facing a large round table with 6 or 7 people. And when I look up, there was a young woman, who was staring at each other. And as I was eating and she was eating, we looked up, we keep staring at each other. So finally, she went to the front door for something. So I told my friend, I said, "I'll be right back." So I walked over to the front door, introduced myself, and got out my little black book. Anyway, I asked her if we could get to know each other or whatever I said. I don't know what I said. Anyway, she said, "You come back and meet my mother." And what she said, that was her mother at the table. So she said, told her mother, and as much she asked me what my name was, and I couldn't tell her my real name because we had been advised not to get involved with the local people. So I didn't know what to do with it. Just call me Johnny Doughboy.
The girl's name was Joyce, a half-Chinese, half-Caucasian British girl. Her mother was not amused that her daughter had brought an American GI to the table, much less one named Johnny Doughboy.
But then she softened. She said, "You can come home, meet her father, and then ask him." So what am I going to lose? So okay, so I told my friends, "I'll see you back at camp." So I followed them home. I met the father. And by that time, the time had passed. It was evening time, was dinner time. They were having dinner, so they invited me to stay for dinner. And after dinner the buses stopped running. So it was blackout time, wartime. The buses quit running when they have lights, because no cars can run with lights. So I had to end up spending the night at the English Red Cross type of for soldiers. So I spent the night there, and the next morning I found my way back to the house, and I started asking if I could come back again, and they just, so I keep going back, and in July of that summer, we were supposed to get married the same week as D-Day, but I didn't know that D-Day was going to happen on June the 6th. We were scheduled to get married on June the 10th, because nobody was able to leave the base because we were invading France. So we postponed our wedding till July the 29th. So we got married, and we got married, and we stayed married until she died at age 79.
From a romantic story of a love at first sight, we're going to pivot in another direction to a love story some might consider less romantic, but certainly no less enduring than that of Beck and Joyce G. Poonam and Atua Sahotra met each other through their parents in an arranged marriage. Their first 2 meetings were with both families, and the third time on their wedding day. They have been married for over 30 years. As first-generation Asian Americans, and from traditional families who believed in arranged marriage, both Mr. and Mrs. Sahotra found the open way of dating and courtship a little daunting in the context of their upbringing.
Made a conscious decision to go this route. Dating is clearly very common. It's easily available, but I did have reservations about it because in the Indian culture, dating, especially for women, was considered to be a very negative thing, that if you were dating that, perhaps your morals were not so high. And, and of course, I was reminded of that too by my parents, that if you do end up doing a lot of dating, then you should probably plan to marry that way and not try to marry the arranged system way, because it just doesn't work that way, especially where women are concerned. It was a little bit different for men versus women, but that's kind of the way that we were raised. And I knew that I wanted to marry someone Indian, and preferably someone from India, because I wanted to keep a connection to India. for as long as it was possible for us to do so.
I guess the family structure is very important, and almost it was almost I grew up with the idea that it's the parents' prerogative to help the children find their spouses. And since the parents know the children very well, I always thought they could probably come up with a better decision than perhaps I could on my own. And also, there weren't too many opportunities for dating and so forth. So I think as long as the children have the veto power, they are not forced into a situation. Uh, I think in parents doing the homework before introducing potential eligible partners to their children, I think is a very good idea. And I think it works in any society as long as there is not the pressure that they have to marry the person that their parents select. And we certainly didn't have that pressure. Uh, and so, to a large extent, it was our choices.
Well, I would say it was our mother's choice.
The Sahotres maintain that while they could have ultimately vetoed their family's decision, there was certainly no love at first sight.
I wanted a tall guy, so I happen to be quite tall for an Indian woman. I'm like 5'6", and I always thought I would marry somebody who was like 6 feet tall. That's what I used to dream about, but that was not really a deep reason to not marry someone.
Well, obviously, we each got a passing grade.
My parents really liked him, and a lot of it is family. So our families are very, I would say, very similar, from the same part of the country, similar values and ethics. And so I think that was super important.
The Sahotres have 2 children, one of whom, their son, Raj Sahotra, founder and executive director of Momentum Education in Houston, has a decidedly different take on love. He reflects on how his upbringing first influenced his own perspectives on love, dating, and marriage.
I think in terms of the romantic or marriage sense, I think there was, and I don't know if this quote was said sort of how frequently, but it certainly came up, as this notion of love will grow over time after, an arranged marriage perhaps happens. And so that was sort of the extent, I'm thinking in elementary, middle, kind of high school even, that was sort of the extent to which the conversation revolved around love with regard to the marriage sense.
Over the years, Raj has found it challenging to reconcile his parents' view with his own. It's a debate that continues to this day.
I think that they come at it from the perspective of what they have seen. And they have seen in their own situation, an arranged marriage where the focus was on aligning the family background, most importantly, kind of worked. And they see their friends from a similar generation, both back home in India and here, who have had a similar situation, and it has quote unquote worked. And then I think there's a contrast with the quote American way of doing things, where someone finds someone who they are compatible with directly, and they see, 50% or whatever the number is of American marriages end up in divorce. And so the conclusion is, the family background way is superior, and don't worry about the kind of love piece, because that will come with time. That kind of comparison of American quote unquote way versus Indian quote unquote way, it misses is that you want to consider both stability, of course, and compatibility, but also kind of the joy and the happiness. And I think the Indian way, quote unquote, kind of indexes more for stability and alignment of important characteristics, but doesn't index as much for joy or happiness, whereas perhaps the Western way indexes a bit more for that, at the risk of potentially not focusing so much on compatibility.
Can love be stable? Should it be? The fact is that almost half of American marriages end in divorce, So it's safe to say that the conventional route of dating before marriage isn't exactly cutting it. How then can we explain that statistics on arranged marriages report that only around 4 to 6% of these quote-unquote loveless relationships fail? Should we be treating marriage more like a business arrangement? How do we account for love, or even define it? In his famous work, The Devil's Dictionary, the writer Ambrose Bierce defines it thusly: love, now, a temporary insanity curable by marriage. Perhaps that's too cynical. Perhaps, suggests Raj Sahotra, a compromise in cultures can help bridge the proverbial divide between head and heart when we consider what love is, or should be.
And so for someone like me who has seen both the traditional Indian mindset and the Western approach, it's about finding the best of both worlds. And I take that perspective in everything in my life, is how do I find the best of both worlds to have the strength of being someone who parents are one culture and is living in another culture. Because to me, that's a big strength, but only if you can draw on the best from both. Because it can become a weakness if you're sort of paralyzed and unable to go to each side because you're very unsure of where to go. And that's when it becomes a challenge. I think it is for many of us, in high school or even in college. But I think as we, get older, reflect more, and are better able to take the best aspects of both sides, it becomes a huge, huge advantage, actually.
It doesn't matter where you were born, how you identify, or from which culture you came. There is no accounting for fate. In the case of Jimmy and Deborah Lin, a last-minute change of plans has led to a lifetime of love and laughter. Well, sometimes laughter. Jimmy Cho Liang Lin is originally from Taiwan. Age 11, he moved to Sydney, Australia to study violin at the prestigious Sydney Conservatorium. He turned 16. He moved to New York City to study under Professor Dorothy DeLay at the Juilliard School of Music. Today, Mr. Lin teaches at both Juilliard and the Chapter School of Music at Rice University.
In 1993, I went to Atlanta for a recital, and as you can imagine, the pianist who plays with me always needs a page turner.
Debbie Lin is originally from Taiwan and moved with her family to Atlanta when she was 17. Debbie is an accomplished pediatrician in her own right.
I was a medical student at Emory University at the time. My best friend, or one of my best friends, was a page turner for the pianist. She was a piano major herself. And I still remember it was October 25th.
The first page turner had gotten ill that day, and she was my wife Deborah's friend. And Debbie had played the piano and studied piano. So the page turner asked her to step in for her to sub for this page turning duty. And of course, page turning is it's a terrible job because you don't notice the page turner until he or she screws up. And then, everybody suddenly turns the gaze to the page turner. It's so embarrassing, And the musicians get really angry at the page turner. But if it all goes well, we barely say a thank you to the page turner.
Because I was so nervous. I play piano, but I don't play that well. And this is not exactly a piano recital. So the pieces were violin pieces. So I was very, very nervous. So I said, you know what, when you rehearse, can I come and practice? First of all, they probably never heard of anybody page turner need rehearsal. Okay, so I'm the only one who actually had to rehearse page turning. So I did. I went there, and then there was like 2 and 3 hours between the rehearsal in the afternoon and the performance, which is at 7:30 at night. So it was too far to go back home, and there was nothing to do in the concert hall, and they were just sitting in the backstage, and so I was sitting there and looking at the drinks and eating the food. And
I took one look at her and said, oh, wow, this is great. What a nice person, beautiful gal. So we started chatting, between the rehearsal and the concert. And so we we I think hit it off okay, that first time. And she asked for a photo to be taken with me. I even put my arm around her. I don't know what got into me, but clearly something was not quite normal. And so I wanted to ask for her phone number, but being, Asian, Chinese, whatever, not so appropriate to ask, hey, what's your number?
And so there's a reception after the concert, and long story short, so he probably, asked around, like, who's this girl? I mean, she's a boyfriend. And so he found out I was single and available, so he decided he wanted to ask me out.
So at the end of the reception, I waved goodbye to her, and then I went back to the hotel with my pianist, Li Jian, and I said, oh man, Deborah, she's a lovely girl, and I'd love to, ask her out, but I don't have her phone number. And suddenly he said, oh, you want her number? I have it. She gave it to me. So he pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket and says, here, you can have it. So I said, okay, I think maybe that's a very smart lady after all, She didn't want to be too obvious in giving me her phone number. She gave it to my pianist instead.
And somehow he got a hold of my phone number, and he called me that night. And of course, he called me, and I was like, what? I think this is the way he said, if I quote it correctly, Doctor, my head hurt.
I don't know if you watch Monty Python. One of the favorite, was this John Cleese character with, looks really dumb. And he'll have a handkerchief twirled around before going to the head. And he'll come into a room, he's a doctor, my brain hurts. So I thought I'll break the ice by saying, since Debbie's a doctor, so I said, hey doctor, my brain hurts.
I think it's probably a quote from the Oz, right? Wizard of Oz. I think one of those. And of course, I have no sense of humor. I said, oh, you have meningitis. Hang up.
And of course, she didn't get it. I said, okay, whoops. That's either starting on the wrong foot, or maybe it's better that she knows that I have a really warped mind to start with. Maybe that's good. But needless to say, we still spoke for over an hour, so that probably was okay.
1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2. Well, there's a sun down.
One thing we can be certain of is that love cannot always be relied on to get the facts. This is one of the beautiful things about love. There's a truth to it, a truth stronger than culture, or tradition, or even memory. Love is immediate, but it can linger for a lifetime. Who are we when we are in love? Does being with someone we love make it easier to be our true selves, or does our true self only reveal itself once we've fallen in love? For many Asian Americans, it can be hard enough to architect an authentic identity when we are influenced by two or more conflicting cultural attitudes about what makes a good person, what makes a family, or how to characterize love. It comes as no surprise that we are at the end of our podcast, and our ideas about what love is, or what love should be, are no more clearer than when we started. Love is elusive, and is avoided capture for this long. Perhaps it's better to let love keep doing its work. That's because love is as expansive and as nuanced as each of us are as people. Most of all, we hope these stories have illustrated, at least to some degree, the transcendent quality of love that travels over time and space to find us and unite us, whoever and wherever we are. Happy Valentine's Day, y'all. See you next time. Love, Asian America.